Hello again. I'm very pleased to be back with you and have a little chat about music and sound. Today I'd like to concentrate a little bit on sound production because, as you probably noticed, there are a number of different pianos in this particular competition which people choose. So I'd like to go back, though, in time to last year when there was the first Chopin piano competition on period instruments. Now, this was very instructive because the pianos that were used in that were very different from each other. A piano like a Graf, a piano like a Pleyel, an Erard, or particularly the difference with a Broadwood. And these instruments were very different. And in fact, what was so interesting was that they reflected the national psyche of the country that produced them. And very often, this was an important factor in geopolitics, which piano you used and what country it represented. This is, of course, no longer the case with us. But it's been very important, I think, that teachers and students too tend to forget a little bit that they are actually producing a sound. And Chopin, in his teaching, concentrated predominantly almost on sound production and touch, that you produced a beautiful tone and that your touch was seductive and gentle and sensitive. In more modern times, the great Russian teacher Heinrich Neuhaus produced this marvelous book everyone should read called Playing the Piano. And in it, there is a very long chapter on tone production and how important this is in playing the piano. Listening to a lot of the young people playing here, I often get the feeling that many of them are so preoccupied with actually getting around the notes of these tremendously challenging works, and also the interpretation of the work and trying to be true to the composer's intentions. They forget that actually they're producing a sound, and that really piano playing, you must listen to yourself. It's very easy to forget that you are the one who's producing this sound, and you forget to listen to yourself. After many years, this often happens. So what I would like to do is play you some extracts from today, actually, where the sound was particularly beautiful, I thought. First of all, the sound from a lady from Taiwan, Yun-Chi Su. And she played for us the most beautiful Mozart. It was the Sonata Number 3 in B flat major. And what I loved about this performance was her joyfulness. I mean, a lot of people play the piano as if they are on Calvary, but actually, this particular performance, it was clear she was enjoying herself, and the sound she made playing this Mozart was beautiful. So I'd like to present to you the opening of the Mozart sonata with her name is Yun-Chi Su, and she's playing a Fazioli instrument. It was this wonderful crystalline sound, and this is the joyfulness. And of course, Mozart composed for a piano called a Walther, which was a Viennese instrument. And it didn't have felt-covered hammers. It had hammers covered in deer hide, in skin. So it had a much more crystalline sound than a modern instrument that we're more used to. The other thing that is very important, of course, is the sound associated with the composition. Now, when you're performing a classical work like Mozart, the sound you want to produce is completely different to, let's say, what you want to produce playing Rachmaninoff or Bartók. Now, Yunchi-Su played also a piece of Bartók. She played one of the Opus 18. Yes, that's the Opus 18 etudes. And I think that this reflected the importance of changing the sound when you change composer. In other words, you should associate certain composers with certain types of sound palette. And I think I'd like to listen now to her playing Bartók, which has a completely different range of colour to the Mozart. Now you can hear a much more percussive sound, has a rougher edge to it. And I think it's very important that when you're playing certain composers, you associate this in your mind. Just following on from the modern part, another pianist from Japan, Yasuko Furumi, played a really demanding work this morning. It was the Shostakovich Sonata No. 1, Opus 12. And I mean this delightfully delicate Japanese lady playing this monstrous piece, I mean, it really is tremendously demanding. And she didn't play the Fazioli, she played a kawai instrument, which is quite popular too. It's not the normal kawai grand, it's a shiguro, I think they call it, and it's a sort of handmade version of the kawai. When you're playing an instrument like this, of course, you have to also remember the action. And I think that with earlier instruments, like the ones I was talking about in the Chopin competition, the Pleyel and the Erard and earlier instruments was mainly finger technique. You didn't use arm weight at all. And that's why the profile of pianists was not the same as we might associate it. So it was mainly finger technique because the action was very light compared to our instruments. So I'd like you to listen to a little of Furumi playing this huge work, demanding work, Shostakovich. never seen anything like that. I mean, it's a ballet performance, as well as the most strenuous physical workout. I'm just, it's awesome, I think, awesome. I mean, if you play the piano, to actually be able to accurately judge those distances is really an achievement. But from the sound point of view, of course, it's so percussive. And that was really what I was trying to concentrate on. You couldn't possibly play this type of music on an older instrument, it would fall apart. And in fact, that was one of the problems that Liszt had. He had to have other pianos waiting in the wings of the theatre because he would be sure to break some of them. I remember Chopin said to Liszt at one stage, Liszt was, they were talking about giving concert performance, and Chopin said he hated playing in front of the public. It wasn't his thing at all, concerts. The exhalation of the crowd he referred to. And Liszt was rather a theatrical character, as you all know, and then Chopin said, well, at least you have the opportunity of murdering them, which of course was an ironic comment on Liszt's technique. Just to finish, I'd like to play a little of a version of La Campanella, which I heard this morning, which was really very, very lovely. The crystalline sound this young Russian produced was very beautiful. And on the Fazioli, it seemed particularly suitable, I thought, for this particular piece. La Campanella is actually a transcription of a Paganini work, but it was little bells, or bells in a bell tower. And certainly you get that feeling if it's not played too fast. So let's listen to a little bit of La Campanella now. Isn't that wonderful? And he's so young, that boy. I think he's about 19. I wish my teacher had said to me, Michael, you'll never make it as a concert pianist. You'll never make it as a pianist. You won't even get into the DVD stage of a competition. But I suppose she needed the money from the lessons. So that's on tone production. And before I finish, I wanted to just say a few words about interpretation, not so much about the sound we're producing. There have been a number of performances of the Les Adieux Sonata of Beethoven in this competition. And when I'm listening to this work, I often wonder whether the young pianist actually connects the emotional feelings that one has when a loved one leaves and the actual music that they're playing. Because it seems very important to connect these, particularly in this particular sonata. They always begin the adagio, which is das Lebewohl, very well, with a great deal of feeling. And that's very good, because that means that the person is leaving, of course. But then when you think about this, when someone leaves, there's a sort of sweet bitterness follows then, and you don't remain in this highly melancholic state. That only lasts when you're waving goodbye to the train or the aircraft or whatever. And then you sort of resume relatively normal life. And I think that as the piece progresses, Beethoven actually tries to express this. Then you have another period of deep reflection, I think. You have lonely periods then. And this is the Andante Espressivo movement, which I think is called Abwesenheit. And that is a very introspective and sad type of reflective composition. And I think that it's very important in the transition to when the person returns, that you don't leap in. I mean, I suppose it's marked attacca. I can't remember the score. That you must start the last movement, which is vivacissimamente, extremely fast because of your joy. But the joy won't come like a light switch. And I think that there has to be just a little hiatus between the expressive sadness and, they've returned, they've come back. So also, the joy of the return is not hysteria. Of course, Beethoven marks it very, very fast. But that doesn't necessarily mean, this sounds ridiculous, but you don't have to play it very fast. Because actually, something can sound very fast on the piano and you're not actually playing it very fast. It just depends how you're articulating it, I think. And I just feel that in expression terms, this particular sonata makes a very strong case for connecting your playing of the instrument with the actual emotions that the composer is trying to express in it. Now, I can't talk about Scriabin. I haven't got time today to talk about Scriabin. But Scriabin is a very good example of where you really need to sort of become a mystic in some ways, because he started to become very, very mystical as his life progressed. And as we all know, he was a particularly eccentric character and wrote a great deal of ecstatic poetry and was very involved in sensual life and erotic life and so on. And I think that in Scriabin, it's even more important to connect the emotions or the context of the music. You hear me talking about context all the time, I know that, but I'm trying to sort of encourage people to build a context around the work that they're performing. And in this competition, there's going to be a prize for the most romantic performance, which I think is a wonderful idea. Because many people feel that although young pianists are playing a great deal of classical works with a great deal of panache and élan, they play Haydn very, very well now with a lot of Viennese Gemächlich and so on, and they play Mozart as we've just heard. But to actually play romantic music, you need to know what was going on a little bit in the life of the composer. This is a contentious point. Some people believe the music is absolute and the composer's life is completely separate from that. I hardly think you can really say that about Wagner, for example. I mean, you can't. And I think that if you go into Beethoven's life and this most tragic document he wrote, the Heiligenstadt Testament, when he was going to commit suicide, because, as he said in this testament, he would wander in the fields and his friend would say, "Oh, listen to that beautiful shepherd's pipe." And he would say, "I can't hear it. I don't hear it." And for a composer of his stature, this must have been profoundly tragic and certainly a reason to commit suicide, I have thought. So I think that it's very important to connect the life. I don't think you can disconnect these things. I mean, in Chopin, for example, can you imagine when Chopin was living in Paris, there was a cholera epidemic. Now, in our world, if there was such an epidemic, not necessarily, if it was, there wouldn't be one, of course, in a major capital. But in Paris there was. And in those days, I've read descriptions of that cholera epidemic, and there were bodies in the streets, bodies going past, heaped up onto carts. I mean, thousands of people died of this cholera. And Chopin was in the middle of this. And I think it's rather foolish to think that this would not have affected his temperament in some way or other. Yes, he was disconnected from his home country and the nostalgia in the mazurkas and so on. But I also feel that his immediate reality, I mean, the breakup with George Sand, for example, would have impacted on his compositions also. So just another one of my little bête noires, I suppose, is to try and examine a little bit the historical background, the art movements of the time, the importance of poetry, and also to try and put yourself into the mindset of why the work was actually written. We had a concerto of Prokofiev that opened this particular competition, which was because a colleague of Prokofiev's had committed suicide. So on that uplifting note, I'd like to conclude this afternoon's little talk. And tomorrow I think I have a guest from Japan, and that will take some of the pressure off me of talking to this camera that's sitting in front of me with its eye looking at me. Okay, so till tomorrow then. Bye-bye.